Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, or depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the second plenary session of today's FOCAC Dialogue, which is brought to you by the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, the ACCPA. We've had the privilege of hosting the first session, which included a keynote and, of course, panel 1 or plenary session 1. We had quite an insightful session with our speakers delivering and answering questions, pertinent questions regarding Africa-China relations and, of course, on FOCAC directly. As we know, this year marks another year, 3 years. FOCAC is organized or hosted every 3 years. In between, there are meetings and lots of engagements ongoing between Africa and China, but the main summit is triannually. So this year, 2024, there's going to be a FOCAC summit here in Beijing, China, where I am currently on a short trip. Now, as we do it, for the benefit of those that knows little about the ACCPA, the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, we are a full-fledged think tank headquartered in Ghana with teams across multiple countries like in the DRC, in Tanzania, in Botswana, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in the UK, as well as in China, and recently in Ethiopia. So we have teams in all these countries that are working to promote and, of course, continue sharing information and insight on Africa-China relations. We've had a chance to organize multiple platforms for engagements as a think tank, as to produce our research work, our papers, and our policy briefs. There is a need to create a platform for further engagement and interrogation, where we can bring an expert panel like what we are doing here today, for them to throw more light based on their own experience and insight in their respective fields. Our focus is on Africa-China relations. Our focus is about Africa's development agenda in relation to its engagement with China. What can make it work for the benefit of the African development, of course, and also for China's development journey as well. As we know, Africa is engaging and has been engaging multiple partners and countries around the world, but we are particularly interested in China, as China has become the continent's leading trading partner for over a decade and counting. We believe that in the future, as we have ahead, China is still going to be Africa's most important trade, economic, and even now social and cultural partner, if you ask me. So it is very important that as Africans, we share our perspective and our insight on what it means for us to continue to engage with China. And that is why we have the ACCPA, the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Our work is scattered for us in this sphere. So as we have it, we have flagship event that we host all year round. And today, this evening, we are hosting the FOCAC Dialogue. Today is the 30th of July, 2024. And as we will have it, coincidentally, today, early hours of today, here in Beijing, China, Chinese government has announced that the FOCAC Summit, which is scheduled to be held in September, will be held on 4 to 6 September 2024. So in a couple of weeks or in the next 2 months, we're going to have the FOCAC Summit, where it's likely there'll be a number of African heads of states and their government interact, traveling to Beijing to engage with the Chinese counterpart. So what we are having here is very simple. We are just doing a precursor to the main FOCAC summit, which I'm sure most of us will not have the opportunity to attend in person or probably follow the discussion. So we're just doing this as a precursor to ask some pertinent questions regarding this engagement, because as you know, FOCAC has become a very, very important platform for the continuous engagement between Africa and China since it was launched in the year 2000. And since then, 24 years, it's still a very relevant and potent platform. And we believe that we owe to ourselves as a continent, as Africans, to interrogate further on what is wrong, what is right, and what could change and what could happen in the course of our engagement with China. So that's what we're having the discussion basically, and we are likely to have both Africans and Chinese that will be sharing their perspective because it's the two regions that we are talking about here. That is why we assemble a panel that has a blend of Africans and of course Chinese to share their perspective on this very pertinent issue. Earlier we had a discussion about the evolution and historical overview about FOCAC. This afternoon session, as we have in the next 1 hour, we're going to look at the FOCAC as a whole and some of the myths and the misconceptions about the FOCAC. Is it coming out of misunderstanding of the whole framework, or these are things that are consciously created to kind of cause a bit of confusion or discomfort for member countries that are engaging with China under the FOCAC? So we try to delve deeper to understand, of course, looking ahead in FOCAC happening in September, what should we expect? What are the expectations from the African side, from the Chinese side? What could be the expectation? And we hope that after FOCAC in September, we will assemble another panel to do a post-FOCAC discussion, which is about right, because we need to then unpack some of the big discussion that will happen here in Beijing in September, so that our partners and our participants can better understand really what the outcomes are. But today we're just doing a precursor to the main summit to share ideas and engage all of us. And then, of course, we will delve deeper into when it happens again in September. We'll have the post-FOCAC dialogue. Now, the session is in 2 parts. I'm going to begin by, of course, I will introduce my speaker, but the first part, I'm going to be asking our speakers some series of questions, just 1 or 2 questions to pick the ideas. While that is going on, then I will invite you, our audience, so send in your question regarding the discussion that we'll be having. If you're familiar with the Zoom app, you can just check the Q&A button and then put in your question there. I'll be more than happy to read this question to our speakers. So please, the second part is about you that has joined us. So try and be involved. We hope to hear from you by sending your questions to get our speakers to address them as and when it is time. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for making the time to join us. Again, this has been brought to you by the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, ACCPA, on the FOCAC Dialogue 2024. So speakers, if it's possible, if you can now turn on, I'll be doing an introduction briefly of our panelists, and then we'll zoom into the conversation right after that. Yeah, just give me a moment. Let me just fetch my speaker's profile. I'll just read briefly about them, and then we can zoom into the conversation. Yeah. Yeah, so we're supposed to have 4 speakers, myself included, making 5. So I'll be the moderator, but Professor David Norrie has not joined us yet. So I'm just going to go straight and introduce the panelists that we have here with us currently. So we have Dr. Filani Ntembu. He is Executive Director for the Institute for Global Dialogue. Fortunately, ACCPA, we have had engagement with them through some of their senior research fellows in the past, where we hosted a senior research fellow from the IGD on one of our dialogue. Dr. Filani Ntembu is Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Pretoria, South Africa. Prior to joining the IGD, he pursued a joint doctoral program with the Graduate School of Global Politics, Free University of Berlin in Germany, and the School of International Studies at Plenary University, Beijing, China. So clearly, he also has a history with China. His recent publications include a single-authored book titled China and India's Development Cooperation in Africa, The Rise of Southern Powers, and co-edited books titled From MDGs to Sustainable Development Goals, The Travails of International Development, Africa and the World Navigating Shifting Geopolitics, Africa-China Cooperation Towards an African Policy on China. So ladies and gentlemen, here we have Dr. Filani Ntembu. You can see in a few minutes, you will get a chance to give his opening remarks. The next speaker we have is Dr. Sophie Wushan Yi. She is a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the Tsinghua University, one of the top universities in China and of course globally. She has a PhD in Chinese Studies Research with a focus on international relations from King's College London as well. She obtained her bachelor's degree in international politics and security studies from the University of Sheffield and pursued graduate studies in economics at SOS, as well as China in Comparative Perspectives with a concentration in international relations at LSE London School of Economics. Currently, she serves as a postdoctoral teaching fellow at Schwarzman College in Tsinghua University and a research fellow at the Graduate Institute, the Grandview Institute, an independent think tank in China. Of course, maybe if there's any updates in her profile, she will tell us, because I got this profile a while back when I hosted some of our earlier platforms. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is Dr. Sophie Wushon Yi with us. And of course, we have Kai Sui, who is, let me just check Kai. So Kai Sui is a banking, finance, and outbound M&A lawyer based in Beijing with the Han Law offices. He's a corporate lawyer in Beijing, frequently advised on Belt and Road Initiative, a very big program as well in that respect. He has advised on transactions in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Mozambique, Madagascar, almost half of Sub-Saharan Africa. He has advised on projects in these countries. He has written frequently about China's relationship with Africa and has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, BBC World Service, and Le Monde Africa. Before starting his corporate career, he briefly worked as a criminal defense clerk in a law firm in Mombasa, Kenya, helping represent suspected Somali pirates standing trial before Kenyan court. So clearly, he also has a very extensive experience with Africa, and I've seen some of his write-ups even on LinkedIn and some of the comments he makes when it comes to China's engagement. We've hosted him before on multiple occasions, and he has a deep understanding of China's and Africa's engagement. So this evening, this afternoon, this morning, we're very privileged to have these experts panel to share perspective with us on the topic that we have at hand today. So again, as I said, we are looking at FOCAC, interrogating key myths and misconceptions. So ladies first, right? So I'll start with Sophie. Sophie, so in the next 2-3 minutes, just give your first impression about the topic that we are having about FOCAC and the myth and the misconception around it. And then from Sophie, we'll come to Filani, and then from Filani, we'll go to Kai. So Sophie, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry, I'm currently on a train, so the signal might be a bit unstable, but I'll try to be as brief as I can. So my connection to FOCAC comes from my professional experience at the United Nations Resident Coordinator Office in Beijing. So our office, when I was working there, we hosted a post-FOCAC symposium in 2023. I think early 2023 or late 2022. So we, as the resident coordinator office in China representing the UN, coordinated the dialogue between the group of African ambassadors in Beijing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Ministry of Commerce, the Exim Bank, etc. All the important stakeholders that matter to, helping to make progress in the FOCAC cooperation. I think one takeaway from working with the African ambassadors and diplomats and understanding the challenges ahead in FOCAC cooperation is that the implementation and operationalization of the big ideas proposed in those kind of forums, especially FOCAC. So the UN, from my perspective, play a very special role in facilitating the operationalization and implementation of the FOCAC plans. And well, from the Chinese perspective, working through the FOCAC mechanism is not only just a bilateral, it's beyond the bilateral or multilateral cooperation framework. It's not only just South-South cooperation that China is trying to promote, but also global and South-South cooperation. And one example I can bring to you is the UN Resident Coordinator Office in Kenya. One of the work they did was to bring together a bunch of multinational corporations such as Merkel's, Philips, Huawei, they were put together in a project to promote maternal health in Kenya. And that was pretty successful, and the UN played a role of facilitating and the cooperation and collaboration. And I guess from what the work we do in China right now is also transforming the role of the UN to help to make things happen faster under the framework of FOCAC. Yeah, that would be my very brief introduction of my professional correlation to FOCAC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So Filani, we hear from you. FOCAC myths and misconception. What is your first comment on this?
No, thank you very much, colleagues. I think thank you for also this platform. I think this is an important dialogue. It's an important conversation. I think, you know, from the time that we, or at least I started looking more closely at China's engagements in Africa. I mean, that goes back to, you know, from the time of doing the book you mentioned, which emanated from a PhD thesis on the rise of Southern powers as sources of development cooperation in Africa. At the time, we found there was a lot of myths on China's engagements in Africa. But some of the myths emanated from the fact that scholars did not necessarily take the time to understand the type of mechanisms, the type of tools that were utilized for furthering China-Africa relations. I'll give an example. When it comes to finance, which of course is an important element of China-Africa cooperation, you would find, and you still more or less still find today, where journalists and scholars and some practitioners are lumping different types of finance that China is providing into the continent. So there are different types of finance, and it's important to understand, you know, the types of finance that China is providing. You have interest-free loans, you have zero interest loans, you have more or less concessional financing. But then you also have financing that is more on a commercial driven scale, but still quite competitive compared to other sources of finance, at least for African stakeholders. And I think at times, the inability to distinguish between the different sources and the different types of financing leads to a number of misconceptions of China's engagement in Africa. So you'll find at times China's commercial financing being lumped together with China's grant funding or interest-free loans, and then all of it being called, you know, China's aid in Africa. And that creates a bit of confusion because, of course, these words have meaning. So once you use the word aid, once you use the word, you know, concessional finance, you have to use it in a way that you are able to actually compare what China is doing with what other stakeholders in Europe, the US, and others have been doing. So a lot of my work around, let's say, comparing the rise of Southern powers in Africa has been really around looking at some of these different sources of financing and trying to better understand the role that they play. The finance that's more commercially driven versus the finance that is more concessionally driven. But I think over the last couple of years, there's a lot more programs, there's a lot more scholars that are doing serious work. There's a lot more information that's coming out from even official authorities that are engaged within FOCAC, and the rise of initiatives and fora like your China-Africa think tanks forum and initiatives such as yours, Paul. I think all of those things help in closing the gap around tackling some of these misconceptions of China in Africa. My last point is that, I mean, one of the most obvious now misconceptions, which we all know, is the issue around debt. We know, for instance, that much of Africa's debt is actually through the hands of private lenders, and many of those private lenders are in the OECD countries. This does not necessarily say there are no debt issues when it comes to China-Africa relations, but it's definitely overblown. But it also conceals quite a lot. It conceals the reality that many of the challenges that African countries that are indebted are facing are not necessarily stemming from direct engagement with China, but are actually stemming from their engagement with many other actors, and many of them in Western capitals and in the private sector. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Felani. The point that the first point really hits it very well about lumping up, all the financing models or mechanisms when it comes to Africa's engagement without, delving deeper into integrating the various mechanisms in terms of the financing that Africa receives. And that leads, of course, the moment you lump them together, obviously you're missing the point, because every other deduction you're going to make from that kind of data, that kind of information, you're going to miss the point, because you just lump everything together to make your projection and make your comment and make your perspective and all. So I think it's a very important suggestion there. I will come back to that kind of discussion as we delve deeper into the myth. Kai, I welcome you to share your first thoughts on this topic. Yeah.
Thanks so much for having me. And also thank you, Dr. Felani, for bringing up the point about financing and getting into the nitty-gritty details to distinguish between all the different sources. That's something I do professionally, because so as both a lawyer for Belt and Road financing and mergers and acquisitions, I have to zoom in, because I deal with individual loans and I deal with individual mines that are to be acquired. So these are the two areas that I'm connected to mainly with Africa. Is there's Belt and Road lending. So this is what that means is there are two large policy banks in China. One is called China Development Bank, and the other is Export-Import Bank of China. And they advance loans very often for infrastructure projects, and the borrowers are very often African governments or public agencies of African governments, and therefore usually they're for roads or for power stations. And besides Belt and Road lending, there's also a lot of outbound investment from China to Africa, and the most vibrant category of outbound investment right now would have to be mining mergers and acquisitions. So what that would be, for instance, a Chinese state-owned enterprise going to an African country to purchase a mining project. Maybe it's copper or lithium. Those are certainly two popular minerals right now because of the energy transition. So I get to zoom in. But I also really like writing and commentating about Africa-China relations, and that allows me to zoom out and take a lot of the details I see when I zoom in with me. But in terms of the big picture, what I find very pleasing to see, especially this year with FOCAC and the dynamic it fosters, is competition. Because FOCAC has inspired so many other countries to follow a very similar format. So I did some work beforehand, before this webinar, to actually count it all up, because other than Dr. Paul, who has actually an article on his website on the think tank's website, I haven't seen anyone else, actually count up all the other Africa +1 formats that are now taking place. By my count, since 2021, there have been 11 of these summits that have been held or will soon be held, including FOCAC. Earlier this year, Italy and South Korea held their inaugural summits. Later this year will be India, and early next year will be the UK's second UK Africa Investment Summit. So grand total of 11 by my count. I might be missing something. I'm only counting the ones where a group of African leaders are invited. So there are actually other formats like Brazil and Indonesia where it doesn't involve currently serving leaders. And I'm not counting earlier this year where the World Bank, I believe, actually had its own summit in Nairobi. So lots of these summits going on. So much so that actually, I believe last year in South Africa, President Ruto of Kenya, he complained about it, and he got a lot of applause actually about how it's just taking up too much of the schedule, you know. And sometimes he remarked, you know, presidents are packed into a bus even, and that although I think for that particular comment, he was thinking about the Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, where the non-G7 presidents were actually given a bus seat. But getting back to the big picture, and what pleases me so much about FOCAC is to see just how much competition it spurs. Because really, I mean, there's good rhetoric in every one of these summits about empowerment, about sovereignty, about partnership. But, you know, what keeps everything honest and what keeps the results robust is if you have a lot of healthy competition. And that's what we're seeing now, inspired by FOCAC.
Thank you, Kai, for that very brief yet very deep first comments on FOCAC. And of course, rightly so, we just, like you said, we did an article tracking the Africa Plus One Summit 3 and all the other summits and what just opposing that to FOCAC in terms of their structure, in terms of their frequency, and the deliberate attempts of all other countries that are trying to court the engagement with Africa. So it was a very interesting article. We have other parts that will come, but yes, we're just trying to look at that, you know, because FOCAC is not the only Africa Plus One engagement. There are lots of them, and we just wanted to tell the potency of all of them and the deliverability, you know, not just rhetoric or shop talk, you know, but there are tangible outcomes that emanate from some of these Africa Plus One engagement, including FOCAC. And so that's very insightful from you. I'll go to Sophie. Sophie, I just want to ask you, we are discussing myth and misconception, which is basically trying to understand or unpack or, you know, kind of, you know, open up, you know, the kind of misunderstanding that emanates from FOCAC. You know, some of the myth around it. Myth means it's not really there, it's just been made up, you know. Misunderstanding is maybe it's there, but just that misunderstood, right? So we just want to just, I believe you have an experience in Europe quite a bit. You schooled in the UK, you're currently in London, I assume. In all those periods that you're there, obviously, maybe even if you're not fully immersed in Africa-China relations there, I'm sure you might have come across discussions in the policy space about Africa's engagement with China. What have you picked? What have you come across in all these years of your time there in Europe in terms of what they perceive the engagement of Africa and China is, and even more specifically if you have, you know, on FOCAC? Yeah.
Thank you for, I think one familiar concept for me was the depth diplomacy, especially I think it was in 2016, 17, there was a time when the concept, the terminology of that diplomacy was all over the internet. It was all over the academia. Everyone's talking about it. And I was at SOS at that time, and we had seminars with a lot of seminars focusing on China specifically. And there was this question raised. And I remember the answer and the takeaway from, you know, really thinking deep about the depth diplomacy was there is no really a check for good loans and bad loans. And that not only goes to China and Africa, but China with its other, you know, collaborators. So this is because when you think of the relationship, especially under FOCAC, China as a economic power trying to leverage and cooperate with the African partners to push forward for international influence in the UN Security Council, for example. There are those kind of perceptions of why China is pushing forward so hard on the cooperation with African counterparts. But on the other hand, I think this is a misconception, because China is also a developing country still, and a lot of the time you don't dump your money for no return, right? So when working on a lot of the projects, they still need to be returnable projects, and I think that is when one of the topics that we came across during the UN conference symposium on FOCAC. The Chinese counterparts would expect a returnable project, and the Global Development Fund has been upgraded in 2023, which means the money is there to be invested, and the UN is there to help and to make sure the standards are met for the whole cooperation and collaboration. And I think that is one way of really meeting the standards of healthy competition and clearing the clouds around that diplomacy, that sort of concepts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So I believe, as you said, in Europe, in the UK, where you were, in the 2016 debt trap diplomacy was a hot topic. It's still a topic, that has been talked about a lot, especially in recent times. The last 14, 16 to 24 months, a number of countries in Africa have been plunged into some debt-related crisis, including my country, Ghana, but I will leave that for later comments. So we'll stay on the debt because it's one of the questions that I actually prepared to raise. Obviously, there's no conversation about Africa-China relations without talking about debt. So I think in the beginning, Filani even made a bit of just about overblown proportion in terms of the debt discussion. So I'll come back to you, Filani, if you can expatiate, this issue about debt trap diplomacy. What is it a reality, or this is just something that has been made up to sort of pull down the sort of engagement that Africa is having with China, and in whose interest is this being served, and all of that? So just try to share your perspective on this debt trap diplomacy.
Yeah, no, I think, and I'll sort of pick up from where Sophie left off. I think it's important to, that reflection. China is still a developing country. And, any sort of credit that is extended, any finance that is extended, you have to really ask yourself, as a developing country, it's quite important that you see some returns from that. I don't think it's in China's interest, to sort of employ some kind of a strategy of trapping, countries in debt. In fact, I think what we need to note is that if we go back to the late 80s, what we saw is that the vast majority of lending towards African countries, vast majority of it came from countries of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, the fact that countries like China entered the scene in terms of revamping and questioning even the development finance landscape, it was partly to address the criticism that developing countries had towards financing that they were receiving from countries in the global north. So countries were complaining about the conditionalities. They were complaining about that essentially even just the repayment of some of the loans that they were receiving. And so you needed competition in the development finance landscape. I think China obviously saw an opportunity in that regard. They understood that this is an area that many developing countries want to see addressed. They want to see more affordable finance. And so in that regard, China stepped up. So I don't think it is in China's interest to pursue a strategy of, let's say, trapping, developing countries. That is just not, it might sound, yes, it's quite a catchy sort of phrase, and it's caught on, over the last few years. But if you speak to people who work in China's policy banks, those people are looking for returns. Those people are wanting to ensure that the projects that they are funding are actually have tangible, results and returns. And so it is important that we contextualize that it is more important for China to see returns than it is, for China to pursue some kind of a strategy of trying to trap, countries in debt. The reality is that the debt that many African countries are owing, most of it is owed towards Western private lenders, creditors that are part of your Paris club. And that is where a significant portion of the debt that, African countries are having to repay is actually being directed there. The unfortunate thing is that, at the moment, you've got a situation where you've got quite a number of countries on the continent spending more on their debt service costs than they're actually spending on things like education and health. And this, of course, is a problem. It restricts not only the relationship that these countries have with their traditional lenders in Western capitals, but it also does restrict the extent to which China can also, find bankable projects to finance. And so, in as much as I dismiss the idea, that China is pursuing a strategy of trapping, African countries in debt, but China has a very important voice to play in addressing the question of affordable finance amongst developing countries. China has an important role to play, especially in multilateral fora, in the G20, in addressing some of the concerns around ensuring that repayment terms are better, for developing countries. And so we have to, of course, keep following it, but it has to be backed up by empirical evidence. If you want to bust myths, then you have to present empirical evidence. And the empirical evidence is simply tells us that much of the debt that is confronting, many of the debt challenges confronting African countries, their root cause does not necessarily stem from the development financing that is driven from China. But the reality is that China also cannot ignore it, because the reality is that these countries also have their obligations to other private lenders. And therefore, it sort of restricts, the space to which we can see a growing expansion of finance into the continent. But we do have to, I think, better understand and better interrogate ways to ensure that finance on the continent is made more affordable. And you can't certainly have that discussion without bringing in the likes of China in that.
Thank you very much, Filani. I think you've explained very much your perspective.
Yes, quickly follow up. I just want to add to Dr. Filani's point, especially your points maybe reflect on the concept of depth diplomacy. I mean, FOCAC and the mechanism is to promote a equal status between China and African countries as collaborators, as partners in development issues. That is what the China and Africa, the global South, really focused a lot on, and the depth diplomacy concept is really tapping itself really taps China and African countries in a really unequal status. It's putting China up and African countries lower, and that is not right. I mean, it shouldn't be, the concept of neo-colonialism is also a term that comes up a lot. That is always misleading, I think. But from what you just said, the policy banks in China wanted returnable projects. And that is the reality that the African countries and Chinese government would hope to push forward under the framework of FOCAC. A lot. I think that would really helps to, explain better and complete the definition of what is FOCAC and how we define this cooperative mechanism.
Yes, thank you very much, Sophie. Before Kai comes in, please, if you have a question, kindly use the Q&A button. If you're familiar with the Zoom app, you can just check on the screen, and then there's a Q&A button that you can just type in your question. In the next few minutes, I'll be reading your questions out to our speakers to address them. Please, we want to engage, you want to get involved in the conversation. So kindly come in. Kai, you want to come in on the debt trap diplomacy situation? If you can just give your remarks on that.
I like to revisit the origin story of that term. I mean, it predates June 2018, but there was one particular story in the New York Times, and I think it was actually splashed onto the front page. So it really popularized this narrative of the debt trap diplomacy, and it zeroed in on one particular loan advanced to the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka by a Chinese policy bank. And the narrative that was portrayed in the New York Times story was that this port is so strategically located that what had really happened was the nefarious Chinese bank had from the start figured out that the borrower, the Sri Lankan government, would not be able to repay the loan that was advanced. And so when there was trouble with repaying the loan because of the general deterioration of finances of the country, not only because of the Hambantota loan, but also those private creditors who make up the international bond market, just as Dr. Filani had pointed out in other countries. So at that point, when the debt got overwhelming, a deal was proposed to sell the port, or rather an 85% interest in a 99-year lease for $1.1 billion, plus a promise of some follow-up investment in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So the idea behind the debt trap narrative was very specific, was this idea that it's actually a plot, to capture this valuable asset. But I find this to be very problematic because, number one, it was suggested by the Sri Lankan government to sell the asset as a quick way to restructure some of the debt. And so it originated from the Sri Lankan government, this idea. And two, it's very hard years in advance to guess what's going to happen. That Sri Lanka would go to the international bond market to raise a lot of funds. This is really not easily guessable what's going to happen, years ahead. So I think unfortunately it was a bad story from the New York Times. And that idea has stuck since then, but it's also morphed because there is no other instance of a loan being converted in this way into a sale. And so now it's just I think a general pejorative term that's used, especially in Western media, to try to portray Chinese lending as a bad deal. And so if really the angle here is that because if a country's economy is not growing fast and it becomes hard to repay a loan, then the term really doesn't mean much.
All right, sure. Thank you very much, Kai. I think for me, I just want to make some few remarks as well from my perspective on this debt trap diplomacy. The first point is that I find that phrase very condescending on the part of the African, right? So it's very condescending in the sense that when you say debt trap diplomacy, they're saying that, hey, you, China is setting a trap for you and you are falling into that trap. What it means is that we don't have mind of our own. We are just clueless. We are dumb. We don't know what we are doing with China. So they are the wisest. They are people that knows best. That to tell us that this guy is setting a trap for you. It's as if we don't have mind of our own. And that's very condescending for me. When I analyze that phrase alone, it really gets me to that level that it's very condescending. It's a look down on the African agency, on the technical strength of the African, the educational level that we have, the kind of technocrats that we have that are engaging China. Every country hires the best of talent and consultants to work with them to engage with China. So what becomes of these resources that African countries put forward to engage with China? It doesn't count. But yes, they're warning you that this guy is setting you up. Don't take anything from this. I think it's very condescending in the first place. Secondly, as Fernani said earlier, look at the numbers. The numbers do not support this phrase, this statement, because majority of the debt, when you track all the debts of any country in Africa, majority of the external debts, because you have the domestic and external, majority of the external debts, the debt, which is the highest anyways, you can see that it's all to private, Western institutions, through most of them through the issuance of Euro bonds over the period. That has accumulated for them to be in that kind of debt distress situation. I'll give an example. Even today in Beijing, during my brief speech here, I gave that kind of analysis, right? When you pick my country, Ghana, as of 2022, our total external debt was about $30 billion, $30 billion. Out of the total external debt, only $1.9 billion is owed to China. This comes out to about 6% of our total external debt. Last year, or later part of 2022, we're in debt-related situation. So the country has to do what we call debt restructuring, both domestic and externally. We have to even go to the IMF for IMF bailout. So we are now in the IMF program. But the conversation around Ghana's debt-related crisis was that we are in debt crisis because of China. So I ask myself, if $30 billion, only $1.9 billion is owed to China, which is 6%, you are claiming it's because of that we are in debt-related crisis. What happens to the remaining 27 point something billion dollars? What happens to that? The 94% left, who owns that, and what happens to that? Again, what happens to asking the question about what those monies are used for in terms of China's $1.9 billion we owe? What were those money used for? Were they used in infrastructure investment that we all know has the potential of unlocking other opportunities for the country, right? We are not allowed to even ask this. So for me, I think clearly from what we are saying, that issue is not there. But that is the extension that Felani gave, that there's a responsibility, of course, on China, looking at where it is in the global space now, in terms of addressing and helping to address developing countries' debt challenges. Not that they are the cause of it, but they can play a role, as you said, in the international financing space and what it can do and what. So that is very insightful from you guys. I want to check if there are any questions here before we continue. So basically, that's what we are looking at in terms of the debt crisis, in terms of FOCAC and the debt related crisis. So so there's another question which revolves around the same conversation we are having, which is that how do you respond to the perception that FOCAC is a platform for China to expand its geopolitical influence in Africa? Again, we're dealing with a question about myth and misconception. So the question is, there's a perception that FOCAC is just a tool used by China to expand its geopolitical influence in and on Africa. So who want to take it first? Who want to take it first? Sophie, you want to come in on this question?
That yeah, sure. Yeah, specifically on that, if we recall the Djibouti, well, China's logistics support base in Djibouti, when the news broke out, because it's China's first, military related logistic base overseas, they raised a lot of concerns from the Western media and in the academia as well, surrounding what is China's intention in Djibouti. And my reflection back then was it's almost like China was the only one who has a base in Djibouti, but that is not the fact, right? The US and many others had bases and cooperation leases with the Djibouti government. So that is not fair to just simply zoom in on China's relationship with Djibouti under the framework of China wanting to expand its geopolitical influence. That is not fair. I mean, a lot of the time when you hear a single-sided argument, you have to look on the other side to be able to really search for a more kind of objective argument in completing the story.
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie, for that. Felani, I want to come in on the geopolitical influence, China using FOCAC as a tool to gain geopolitical influence on Africa.
Look, I think, again, what that basically assumes is that Africa has no interest, or that Africa is a passive actor in this forum. Africa has never been a passive actor. In fact, when FOCAC was founded, let's just go back to memory lane. It was in the year 2000 when The Economist magazine published, and said on their front cover, Africa, the hopeless continent. They said hopeless continent. Now, if that was the attitude of, a publication like The Economist, but also if that attitude reflected the attitudes of other nation states in Europe and in North America, then Africa had very strong interests at utilizing a rising power like China to expand its own policy space and to elevate its own voice in the world. And look what happened. I mean, look what our fellow panelists, mentioned, that FOCAC became a catalyst for greater competition, where suddenly you have more actors throughout the world, both in the global south and in the global north, initiating fora such as FOCAC. Now, I mean, it's easy. We can criticize, the EU-Africa summit as just an EU-driven initiative. We could criticize the US-Africa meetings as just a US-driven initiative. We could criticize the recent South Korea-Africa summit as just a South Korean-driven initiative. And likewise with Turkey, with India, with a whole range of actors. But unfortunately, it's too easy. It has become too easy to exclude the agency and the interests that African actors actually have. And if you look strategically, is that African countries have actually succeeded by using FOCAC. It's not to say that they've gotten everything that they've wanted, but by utilizing FOCAC, they have actually forced some of their other partners in the West and also in other parts of the global South to actually stand up and say to African stakeholders, this is what we can offer you. You know, this is what China's offering you, but this is what we can offer you. So what FOCAC has done for African stakeholders, it is that it has expanded the number of potential partnerships in trade, in investment, in cultural ties, but also in, you know, the space of development finance. And so African countries have more options. Now, the reality is that not all of those countries have the same capabilities to actually go after, you know, their interests through these different fora. But from a strategic level, I think it's very simplistic to say that, you know, FOCAC is just driven by China. Of course, FOCAC is important for China. And it also emerged at a time when, you know, China wanted its companies to internationalize. It wanted, you know, Chinese funding institutions to internationalize, to sort of, you know, get their hands dirty in other parts of the world. And so, yes, FOCAC from a strategic point of view is very important for China, but that should not negate the fact that FOCAC is of strategic importance for Africa. And you can see that it remains of strategic importance for Africa, because recent years there was an article which actually compared the number of heads of state, African heads of state, that are attending a FOCAC summit versus African heads of state attending, you know, for instance, something like the UN General Assembly. And, you know, you could see that clearly from a political, from an economic, from a strategic point of view, African partners still view FOCAC as being of strategic importance, but they utilize FOCAC to also get better deals from some of their Western partners and also from some of their other partners in the West. So we shouldn't exclude Africa's own agency and interest in having seen the founding of FOCAC and in having seen, you know, from 2006 up to 2018, a you know, sort of every year or every summit, a doubling of the financing that has been coming from African stakeholders. Last point is that we shouldn't also forget that in China formulating its China-Africa strategy, both the first China-Africa strategy and the second China-Africa strategy, there was a lot of input by African stakeholders. And there was also a lot of listening from the Chinese side to try and ensure that the interests that China articulates are also in line with the interests being articulated by African stakeholders.
Thank you very much, Plenary. Obviously, it touched extensively on the African agency in that kind of context that, you know, we just a tool used by China. So our interest as a continent, when we actually, an African leader was the one that actually proposed the FOCAC in the first place in the year 2000, as you rightly said, populous continent, FOCAC happening in the same year. Show me your friend, and then I'll show you your true color. That's a friend in need is a friend indeed, as I always say. So Kai, please, can you share your perspective on this issue about China using FOCAC as a tool for their political and geopolitical advantage to influence African geopolitical?
You know, of course, I think every participant in the summit has an agenda that's geopolitically driven. And so it's a fair bargain as long as everyone has a chance to promote their agenda. And going back to the origin story of FOCAC itself, I believe it was diplomats from Madagascar and several other African countries who nudged actually their counterparts here in Beijing to start FOCAC, because going back all the way to 2000, if you just look at the state of Chinese diplomacy in the year 2000 and the international profile, it really wasn't much to speak of. And so it seemed actually sort of out of nowhere, FOCAC, because how would they possibly have the confidence to run something like that involves 50 different countries? And the truth is they probably didn't have this confidence unless they were being nudged by very encouraging words from several African countries. And I think that it's a nice perspective to think about, in that it shows that FOCAC probably came earlier than otherwise would have, if not for African encouragement. And it does show African agency in that FOCAC, especially after 2006, when when top leaders gathered together, and finally there was a lot of international attention given to FOCAC as a concept. And that spurred, of course, many other countries to think about how they can review their engagement of Africa. It shows that at the genesis of all of this was actually, Africans coming together and pushing and orchestrating something that changed the perception of the continent. So I just want to echo, everyone else's point about that. And if I may, I see that there's a question about the critical minerals from Ambassador Dennis. Could I address it?
Yes, I was about to go there, but you can touch on that. So, or maybe let me read it for others to also hear what the question is. So Ambassador Dennis is asking, in light of the competition between over battery technology breakthrough between China and US, the US has now decided that there's a need to block China's access to critical minerals needed for this battery technology. Africa has some of these minerals. Your thoughts on the implication of this for Africa-China relations? So there's a competition, global competition on battery, the mineral resources to produce these batteries. You can find some of them in Africa. And the question is saying that US is making plans to block China's access to these minerals. What should happen in the context of all of this? So you can comment on that, right?
Yeah, I've been at least following the news on this, and actually I believe this question is pegged to a recent news event where earlier in the month it had been announced that there was a cobalt mine in the DRC that was distressed. And I don't know if it has ceased operations already, or it might cease operations, but it's distressed, and it was going to be purchased by a state-owned company of China, and it appeared that everything was in order for closing. However, in the news, one of the shareholders of the cobalt mine in the DRC is actually a DRC state-owned mining company. They are a minority shareholder, but I believe that they have the right to veto such, a sale. And in the news, it appears that they will exercise that veto. And also in the news, it was the reason for them exercising this veto was encouragement by the US. And furthermore, it appears that the US government at least tried to find some alternative buyer. For example, in Zambia, there's a US mining company backed by a lot of Silicon Valley titans that uses AI to make discoveries, so very high profile, but they're in the AI business, I guess, and they didn't want to pursue this opportunity. So the US government failed to find an alternative buyer, but nonetheless compelled the DRC to block the sale. And I think the fear in that is that, well, is it just going to be limited to something like cobalt, which truly is a critical mineral because of You know, outside of the DRC, there's not many other sources of cobalt. Or is the US government going to become even more aggressive and look at even more minerals in Africa and just try to make sure that Chinese entities don't buy them? And if Chinese entities don't buy them, like in this case, nobody else is going to, and the mine will cease to operate. So that I think let's hope this is really going to be an exceptional case, and but of course it's possible it could expand.
Thank you, Kai, for that answer to Ambassador Denny's question. We'll be wrapping up very soon because we've done over an hour already, which is getting a bit late here in Beijing for Kai and myself as well. So we'll be wrapping up very soon. In this respect, you can still send your question if you have any question. Please exercise it by using the Q&A button and bringing your question. In that respect, there's a question on neocolonialism, which is something that we've already dealt with. So I guess this is a general question, really, about how to deal with some of the challenges that emanates from Africa-China engagement. What will be policy recommendation targeting FOCAC? FOCAC is happening between the 4th and the 6th of September here in Beijing. So in this case, we just want to pick your perspective in terms of what your expectations are, judging from the last FOCAC that was held in Dakar in Senegal, which of course partly virtually because of COVID. So if you can just give your sense, your expectation will be towards FOCAC happening in the month of September. So we'll start with Plenary, and I'll come to Sophie, and then I'll come to Kai.
No, thank you. And I'll link this, try to just be very brief, but I'll link it with what our previous panelists made mention of. I guess it's linked to the question that was in the Q&A. And it links specifically to this opportunity of this forthcoming FOCAC. Firstly, this forthcoming FOCAC is an opportunity to, I think, inject some energy into FOCAC. Of course, having the last summit, having had an interruption, obviously, through the pandemic. And so this is an opportunity to, I think, breathe new energy into it. It also is an opportunity for Africa, and this is linked specifically to that question, to utilize the geopolitical context in its favor. The fact is that if the US is trying to restrict China accessing critical minerals in Africa, that is a strategy that is not likely to succeed. We saw also recently that the South Korea Africa summit, for instance, one of the major priorities they had on their minds was access to critical minerals. Of course, Korea gets most of its critical minerals through China. And so one of its strategies is now to try and engage more directly African sources to get that. Now, this is an opportunity for African stakeholders because it's an opportunity to try and see, whether they can get, the likes of China to invest in the development of your regional value chains in Africa, to ensure that, of course, there will always be some degree of, just extracting raw materials. But we need to come up with very tangible business cases for the development of those technologies in Africa, in our own regions. Of course, some of it will go back, yes, to China, but there we have to look at also the business case of China developing those minerals closer to the source. And China can link this with also its own strategy of advancing in high technologies. So for instance, China is obviously getting much more proactive in terms of electric vehicles. including in expanding its own footprint in Africa for those electric vehicles. Now, if you can link that with the minerals that are required, you know, to make those electric vehicles, to make those battery technologies, then this is potentially an opportunity for another growth spurt for specific regions on the continent, where we can create regional value chains linked to those critical minerals. This obviously also ties to the climate change and to the production of new sources of energy. And so this is how African countries need to be going to FOCAC with tangible projects that they can present to our counterparts in China about the development of these regional value chains, so that China is also producing closer to its market in Africa, but also utilizing Africa's geographic location to also access markets in Europe, depending on where it sets up plants, and also to, you know, to access markets in the Americas and also in Asia, using the strategic location of the African continent. And so Africa's work is about really presenting tangible, workable business cases of projects that will have returns both for Africa, but that will also have returns for the Chinese side. And if we go there, then I think we can reinvigorate Africa's agency within FOCAC.
Thank you very much, Felani, for that. There's very remarkable feedback on that. I'll go to Sophie for your comment on the issue about expectations going to FOCAC in the month of September.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Felani and Kasia, for your input and insights. I'm sorry about this. I'm currently in the various stations, so there's too many people, so I won't have my cameras on. But on FOCAC, I think China and the African continent have a lot of similarities. Especially, I'm currently working with the UN FPA, the Population Fund, in Beijing. So not only we work on issues such as promoting maternal health, sexual reproductive health and rights. So China actually have a lot of experiences in how it overcomes the development issues such as those kind of maternal health and population, and also the other issues that it could leverage its experience and expertise in how it overcomes those obstacles and challenges itself to support its African counterparts in confronting those kind of development issues. And I think I'm really optimistic about the upcoming FOCAC because the African continent is full of hope. There is a large youth employment force, youth labor force, and there are exchange programs such as the Luban project, which helps exchange expertise and technical education between China and Africa, and also things like the e-commerce training and the establishments of the industrial parks. Those are some of the issues that China has overcome itself, and I think the FOCAC mechanism could actually be mutually beneficial for each other and really move forward with more tangible projects, as Dr. Felani just mentioned.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So she just kind of highlighting some of the challenges that China has overcome and what that could do for Africa and how the continent should approach China or FOCAC in September, going forward about the Luban workshop, some of the industrial economic zones, how that has opened up China attract a lot of investment and all of these tangible stuff that has to go into FOCAC. Kai, there's a question. So I will tie that question to about your expectation on FOCAC. So this from Devans. I think Devans, if I recall, Devans maybe worked for media that maybe I'm aware of. So he's asking that this question is for you. Is that the Kenya Standard Gauge Railway, the AGR, whose construction store somewhere in Naivasha in Central Rift Valley? Is there a possibility that China will fund the remaining section to Malaba, the border with Uganda? What are the likely financial options from China for such a large infrastructure project and reduce Chinese bilateral loans? I guess this is your area of in terms of Belt and Road, and then of course having worked in Mombasa for a couple of years back. Yeah, so you tie this question to your expectation of FOCAC. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you know, there's still infrastructure lending that continues, and in fact, you know, I've been at work, you know, rushing to complete one such lending project just in time, I think, for FOCAC, which is which one of the new forms of lending will actually be to lend to what are called like the regional or mini multilateral development banks within Africa, like East Africa, West Africa. There are these regional banks, and they will on lend for smaller projects, you know, also in transportation, but also agriculture. And so that's one format. That's one form of continued development lending. And of course, it also means that if you aggregate all the loans under this format, it doesn't amount to what it has in previous years. And I mean, just for reference, back in 2016, if you were to look at the two policy banks and African governments borrowing, I think there was announced almost $30 billion in commitments for lending. And so in the next 3-year period, it will not reach that level. And because to complete the rest of the SGR and get it to Uganda, it will be a multi-billion-dollar loan. So I think in this next 3-year period, I can't be sure, but just looking at the scale of lending in the near future, I don't feel that there will be that commitment for that project. As for other options, I mean, but you know, here's the great thing is that because there are 10 other summits, and you know, there's of course the US, which has promised to back its own railway to the Atlantic to compete with, of course, SGR, which is to the Indian Ocean. So that's a great parallel. And actually, through Tanzania, part of that financing of Tanzania's own SGR, which was recently launched, was from Turkey. So all of these other summits are producing, you know, competitive results in terms of alternative projects, or hopefully, you know, maybe sometimes you can get bids for lower interest rates and better return terms for the same kind of project because there are so many competitors. So I think there is hope with healthy competition that there are other financing options. But as for Kenya itself, I think it is also, you know, a difficult period for Kenya. It has not defaulted, but as we saw recently, it would be there's no way they can raise taxes, the government, because of the turmoil that it caused recently in Kenya. And so I think it's just in general going to be hard to borrow enough to sufficiently to finish that project in the near future.
Okay, Kai, thank you very much. I think we've had a very insightful conversation. I think we've been done past the estimated time that I plan to have this session. So I will give this platform opportunity to for our speakers to give their last remarks on everything that we've said and discussed here. And also, if you're here, please, all our speakers, as their names show on the screen, you can find them on LinkedIn as the name that they have there. And connect with them, and you can engage with them. They are all friendly people that you can always send them your questions via LinkedIn. So kindly do that if you are not connected to them on LinkedIn yet. And then you can engage them further in terms of the conversation that we are having here, or any other question that you might have regarding Africa China Village. So I'll start with Sophie. If you can give your last, remarks, and then we can wrap up. Then Sophie, then Belani, then Kai.
I just thank you everyone for your insights and ideas. I really learned a lot, and I hope to continue the conversations as well. Thank you.
Belani, your last words.
No, excellent. No, colleagues, thank you very much, I think, for this platform. I think what it does highlight is that relations between Africa and China over the last, let's say since FOCAC was founded, have really deepened beyond a state-to-state type of relationship. We've seen a lot more platforms added. We've seen the business community of both China and Africa become more vocal, more influential, and certainly think tanks. And so the role of research has become much more important. And I think also we've seen a lot more engagement amongst our respective people from China and Africa. And I think that just bodes well for the relationship going forward. I do think there is a certain degree of maturing that is taking place. And that links to the previous question, that it's not just about, the financial commitments going up every time, that FOCAC is hosted. I think we're in another era where we're seeing a maturing of some of those earlier commitments, but where I think the engagement becomes much more, less about quantity, but where it becomes more about the quality of the engagement, the quality of the projects that are identified and funded. And so, yeah, looking forward to the forthcoming FOCAC and, the commitments that will come out of that. Thanks, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Belani. Kai, please, your last comment.
Thanks so much for having this panel. It was a wonderful discussion, and I learned a lot, and I got to think a lot also about these issues. And just to echo one point that's made in the question and an answer I see from the last comment, I think I agree with the point made by the comment, is that to build this trust, with FOCAC, these projects have to be seeing and actually benefit the people. And it's a point that I really would actually like to elaborate more on if given a future chance in a panel, because I think with now so many years of engagement and now things becoming mature, we don't necessarily need to find new projects. We have so many hundreds of large-scale projects in the past that can be revisited and actually enter into a phase 2 where we can improve on top of them and make sure that they are seeing the benefit to people. And that's what will foster trust.
That's a very important point. So, because almost always, it's the euphoria towards some of these, especially FOCAC now, people are just eye cleaning, looking forward to the big new announcements, right? Ignoring all other commitment that has happened in the past. So I think hello, am I audible?
Yes, we hear. Yes, we hear.
So I was saying that obviously your point, the last point that you made is very important, because FOCAC 2024, and people are looking forward to running health test about what is the big thing that's going to happen, what are the new big things that's going to be announced, and all of that. But you made a critical point that maybe it's about time you go back and do the phases, the new phases, upgrade, those existing commitments, so that we see real tangible, benefits and that's all part of the kind of engagement that we should have. So thank you very much, gentlemen and lady. It's been a pleasure hosting you for all of us at the ACCPA, the Africa China Center for Policy and Advisory. We just want to say thank you for making the time to join us. We know it's late here in Beijing. Of course, it's also getting late in South Africa and in the UK, but we are very much grateful for your time and the insights shared. This session has been recorded. We'll prepare it and have it on our YouTube. We'll share it by email so that you can rewatch it. For those of you that join us online, we say thank you for joining us. This has been brought to you by the ACCPA. We hope to come your way again very soon with some of our platforms. You may want to follow the ACCPA on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, on TikTok, everywhere you can find us, and so that you can get updated on the new things that are happening at our center. And I hope that together we can create an environment for learning and knowledge exchange. So thank you very much. Until we meet again next time, I say bye-bye. Bye.